Well, good evening. Good evening. Come on in. Come on in. All right, here we are. I think this is week 6 of our class. Let me take you back 2 weeks ago. Continuing our theme of a cultural, social, political dynamic of ancient Israel, the time of the Old Testament. 2 weeks ago, we started really in-depth, and I'll come back to that word in just a second. We started, granted, what is an in-depth look at this idea of God's chosen people relative to the state, or relative to being a liberated nation, relative to this idea of nation. And if you'll remember, 2 weeks ago, I asked you to think about that from a patriarchal standpoint. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, those faith leaders who, in Abraham's case, were specifically called by God. And we understood then that, Israel's cultural cornerstone was set when God chose Abraham. And we tied God's calling of Abraham to this concept of holiness, that is being called out, that is being set apart for a purpose. For a purpose. And we looked at different ways where, God was commanding Israel through his promise to develop a national identity. In other words, develop a culture based on God's holiness. They were to be holy as God was holy. And so then last week, we in so many words, continued that theme, although we didn't talk about it in those terms very often, but we continued the thought of Israel, God's chosen people relative to the state. And there we did talk about Israel being a liberated nation, them being Moses leading them out of Egypt, the Exodus, and how that Exodus set Pharaoh up against God, and how God was clearly not impressed with Pharaoh as much as Pharaoh was impressed with Pharaoh. So God drew them out. God called them out, led them out of Egypt. But the idea is still the same. Culturally, socially, and we use the word political. A lot of times, 2 weeks ago, last week, this week, we're actually using that word political, meaning more from a governmental standpoint. How did Israel set up their government? So, just think of that as synonym. But, God called Israel out of Egypt. And at that point, God was really requiring Israel to work out both a moral and social identity. And that moral and social identity was designed by God to be inseparable from them as God's people. That was to have been one and the same. And so we started to see how Israel as a liberated nation began to struggle with that. Substantially struggle with. What does it mean to be both called out by God, as you think about Abraham, to be set apart, holy, continue that theme, Israel called out by God, as God's chosen people, subject to God. Right? And then so tonight, we'll continue with sort of the chronology and look at Israel, at least the beginning of their monarchy period. Right? Kind of what you would expect. Start with the patriarchs, the Exodus, and now the monarchy. Looking at the first 3 or 4 kings. I frame it in these terms because, to my eye, the themes are still very much the same. They're being called. Even when Israel declared their desire for a king, we'll get into the detail here in just a minute, but even when Israel declared their desire for a king, God said, sort of reluctantly, but he said, okay. Almost as if God sort of rolled his eyes and said, fine, whatever, I'll make it happen anyway. But God chose that king. He allowed the king to exist. God chose that king, the first king being Saul. God chose that king. But God clearly still expected that king to live subject to God's law. And we'll get into some of that in just a few minutes. I'm going to take you to 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 1 through 22. It's the entire chapter. I'm going to read that because it establishes a lot of context. And then I'm going to bounce through, once we read it and understand what's there, I'm going to bounce through 1 Samuel chapter 8. Before we go any further, let's go to God in prayer and ask His blessings on our study, and then we'll dig in. God and our Father in heaven, we glorify your name. We praise you. We honor you. We are here tonight to study the truth of your word. We ask that you open our minds and open our hearts to what that truth is. We ask, Father, that you increase our understanding of you, your will for us, and that you increase our courage and our strength to live lives that glorify you. We pray these things through Christ. Amen. Okay, 1 Samuel chapter 8. Now it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside from dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "Look, you're old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations." But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Heed the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them, according to all the works which they have done since the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods. So they are doing to you also. Now, therefore, heed their voice. However, you shall solemnly forewarn them and show them the behavior of the king who will reign over them." So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who asked for the king. And he said, "This will be the behavior of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for his own chariots and to be his horsemen, and some will run before his chariots. He will appoint captains over his thousands and captains over his 50s. Will set some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and some to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers. And he will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive groves, and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and your vintage, and give it to his officers and servants. And he will take your male servants and your female servants, your finest young men and your donkeys, and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your sheep, and you will be his servants. And you will cry out in that day because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, and the Lord will not hear you in that day." Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, "No, but we will have a king over us, that we may also be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." And Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he repeated them in the hearing of the Lord. So the Lord said to Samuel, "Heed their voice and make them a king." And Samuel said to the men of Israel, "Every man go to his city." We're going to dig into everything that's going on here. And granted, I've always, this entire series of studies, I've taken you pretty deep. And I think that this is particularly important, that we do this deep dive, not for the sake of just the detail, but for an increasing in our understanding of, for example, what does it mean to be God's people? What does God expect when he calls his people? How does Abraham, who heard God, responded and obeyed through faith, relying on the promise of God that would come to pass hundreds of years after Abraham died? How does all of that relate to us, right? Those are the big picture questions that we're always trying to wrestle with. And I've used the term, be it Abraham or Israel, I've used the term they are an analog for us. They are similar to us in so many ways that we should be paying attention. And by really digging deep into this, we start to understand more what was going on. Keep in mind that, going back to the first week, we talked about the biblical text as an accounting of events that happened, as opposed to using the word Bible story. And if you remember that conversation, I was very specific, right, in why we would make that distinction. We understand it's really synonymous. But by stopping and considering the difference between an accounting and a Bible story, it does help sort of put our minds in a different frame of reference, right? We understand the context better. The second thing is through that deep dive, we start to understand that since these are accountings, we're talking about, for the last few weeks anyway, governmental dynamics. And we can understand that. We might not always use that term, but we can understand that, right? We see the stories in the news about our own government and the decisions that are being made, be it by Congress or by executive order or rulings at the Supreme Court, right? We understand this idea that governmental dynamic is constantly ebbing and flowing. It's a constant change over the course of our lifetimes. Lisa and I had a conversation actually this past Saturday night with someone. And we were talking a little bit about the United States. And I made the comment, a lot of what we see and hear about in the news are things that within my lifetime, I'm 57, so 50 years ago, you wouldn't have heard about. At least not so much. And so the point I was trying to make was the dynamics in the United States have occurred within 50 years. That's a relatively short period of time. Now, there's nothing new under the sun, and human nature is what it is, and it's probably no different than it was 50 years ago in a lot of ways. It's probably no different than it was in Samuel's time in a lot of ways. That's why it's relevant to us today. So I hope you appreciate the deep dive. I wanted to recognize the fact that it is a deep dive, and I'm asking you to really dig in with me. Okay, 1 Samuel chapter 8. Two things here that appear perhaps contradictory. The first is that we read, God recognizes that Israel's desire for a physical king is a rejection of God and God's intended social, political, cultural relationship. God tells us, he told Samuel, don't worry about it. They're not rejecting you, they are rejecting me. Yet, we also read God telling Samuel, listen to what they say, do what they ask. And I bring it up now in this point of the conversation because understanding those two sides of the coin, in my mind, helps to provide context. It helps us to gain insight into the entire chapter of 1 Samuel chapter 8. And then as we would continue reading in 1 Samuel, as Saul is installed as king, David eventually comes along, followed by Solomon, and then the wheels fall off the bus with Solomon's sons, Rehoboam, and then Jeroboam coming in sort of as a backdoor solution, which is what we'll talk about next week. But those two things are seemingly contradictory. And I really struggled in my own studies with this and came to the conclusion that just like God allowed for divorce because of the hardness of their hearts, that to me seems like a pretty good way of thinking about God allowing them to set up an earthly king, right? It's sort of a concession that God seems to be making where, you know, when you take that step back and look at the big picture, I said a few minutes ago, it's as if, to me, it's as if God does sort of roll his eyes, give him the big whatever. You're not going to do it my way, but we're going to get my will accomplished in the end. So that's kind of how I'm reading God's response to Samuel. Let me pause there. Any thoughts? Jim.
Thought, was he thinking that we should stay with the judges then, instead of going to the king?
No, God's thought was God was king.
Okay, but I mean, in that other form, was he saying, like, these folks have, what was his plan for these people?
God's plan was that Israel was to be a theocracy. Now, yes, to your point, God brought along the judges. He brought along the prophets. As kings got installed, he had a book of the rights and duties of the king that kings were to read and copy. So God intended all along one theocracy, just God, but there were earthly leaders. I would say that I would say they were representatives of God, chosen by God to help the people along. And they did tend to be regional, yes.
If you will, or across the entire nation.
Yeah, well, you do have the 72 elders, you know, which were regional by tribe, right? Yeah, Matt.
So the judges that God had appointed at that time, or that had set up, were to judge according to God's law. And I think verse 20 there is a key to what the people are thinking. They didn't want to be judged according to God's law. It says, we want to be like all the nations that our king may judge us. So it's according to the king's law. They wanted somebody like the nations did.
Hold that thought. I don't disagree, but if you read the text deeply, the request for a king actually is pretty pragmatic. If you just take it at face value. We want someone to judge us. Let's assume that would be based on God's law. We want someone to judge us, and we want someone to lead us in battle. Those are pragmatic basis. That's a pragmatic basis for a request. Right?
Well, yeah, the request, but we know what's going to happen, and God knew what was going to happen, is that instead of using God's judgment, it was going to be the king's judgment.
Yeah, so if you fast forward 4 kings later, which again is what we'll talk about next week, you get to Jeroboam, who comes in as a king, right? In contrast to Rehoboam, Solomon's son. Jeroboam immediately realizes he has a political problem. He's afraid that the people in his kingdom are going to go south to worship in Jerusalem, and he's afraid once they get there, they won't come back. So he creates these 2 calves, idols, and, pardon me, and high places, and said, ta-da, there's your God that led you out of Egypt. But the motivation, and maybe this is, I think, your point, the motivation was solving a perceived political problem. It was not a real intent to remind Israel of their God. Jamie?
Just understanding your pragmatic reason, what was the trigger for all of this? Well, it was Samuel appointing his sons who weren't like him, meaning they were, sinful, criminal, evil, however you want to say it. So the people were looking for a just ruler, right? And they were really kind of rebelling against rebellion in a way.
Agree. Again, it comes back to a pragmatic recognition that Samuel's sons are not like Samuel, that they are, where does it say? Turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. Ken?
I see it as this covenant relationship that they had with God. Now all of a sudden, to your point that you made earlier, they're walking away from God. And so in their desire to walk away and want an earthly king rather than the heavenly king, he allows them to go down this road that eventually they'll pay the consequences of their desires by serving someone else rather than keeping the covenant that God has established.
God will allow them to go down that road. Yeah, and God will allow us to go down any road we choose to go down, right? Again, there's a comparison here that we should be paying attention to. Hold on.
At the same time, God's plan is always going to be worked out. King David, Messiah, is going to be coming through the king, one of the kings that they have now been begging for. So his plan is always going to come.
So if you couldn't hear, the comment was, at the same time, based on everything that we've said, even still, God's plan will be worked out, right? Regardless of the choices that they make or regardless of the choices we make. And you pointed to King David. So I would actually summarize Saul, David, Solomon. They suffered Saul. They honored David. And I'm sorry, they tolerated Saul. They honored David. They suffered Solomon. Joe?
To me, it's kind of simple. It's like today. They had the same problem God did then than we do today, or that God has today. I want it my way, not your way. It's my highway, not your highway. And that's exactly what it was back then. I mean, it was the devil was working the same way back then that he's working today. Do it my way. Forget about God's way. Now, God has said that we'll always be a segment of us that's here, that's living it the right way, doing our best on that. And that was the same thing back then. They eventually end up with another king that would be good, and ever so often they'd have somebody try to carry them back. But we see that today with the church on there coming. It'll grow, then it'll drift away. Then it'll grow back, and it'll drift away. You think about that. That's not a dime's worth of difference than what we're facing today. And are we going to really learn anything? I think that's the next thing. Do we learn anything that it's best to stay with God today?
So, just if you couldn't hear, and for those online, I'll try to summarize, keep me honest. The Israelites were demonstrating a what seems to be a human desire to do it our way rather than God's way. And there are consequences. God may allow us to do that. He allowed them to do that, but there are consequences. And do we learn anything from that? History would say not very often, but if we are of the mind to learn, there's a lot there to learn. Thus, the reason I'm digging in so deeply in this entire class is to help us learn.
In Romans chapter 1, verse 28, it says, since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. And so Old Testament God gave them up to fulfill their lustful desires, and the New Testament the same. And God will react the same today with us.
Yeah, so again, if you couldn't hear, you took a verse out of Romans recognizing that at some point God gave them up to a debased mind. In other words, he recognized they had reached a point where they were not going to return. And God allowed them to do what they wanted to do, to their eternal detriment. Not much has changed. It's up to us to change and try to change it, but no, it seems like not much has changed. We have about 15 minutes. I've got 3 pages of notes. We've actually touched on a lot of it, and I appreciate the discussion. It's much appreciated, so thank you. Let me just run through. Verse 20. There are some reasons, Matt Guy, to your point, there are some reasons requesting this physical king, which seem unremarkable at first, even justified in some sense: leadership against the enemies, protection of justice within Israel, and a reaction to Samuel's 2 sons, which had been appointed judges and were clearly not handling that position as they should have. So those are practical reasons. We didn't mention it, but Samuel is old. He's near the end of his life. Perhaps Israel is blaming Samuel because Samuel's old. We've got these 2 sons. Nothing's working out. What else are we to do? There's some things that you could read into that. I want to be careful, right? Let's not overextend what the text actually tells us. But I did speculate that maybe there's some blame game being played here a little bit. Perhaps that blame is to allow Israel to get to where they want to be anyway, right? They use that more as justification than real reason. So I think there's a lot here going on. Verse 5, the truth finally comes out. To several people's points, we just don't want to live based on God's plan.
So even Samuel didn't wait for God to choose the judge. He said, I'm going to choose the judge. So Samuel's going to his.
Yeah, really good point. Again, if you couldn't hear, Keith recognizes then in chapter 8, verse 1, that Samuel is choosing his sons as judges rather than allowing God to work in God's time and choose who should be judged. Who should serve as judge. Jamie?
They're trying to help God achieve his mission, right? And they're saying, hey, Samuel, we need you to do this before you die, and we're stuck with these 2 evil sons of yours who won't do this for us, right? So they're probably trying to kind of protect the nation of Israel, right? That's a good motivation.
Seems to be. Yeah.
But they're trying to help God along, and it's just trying to sort out. We've already seen Nadab and Abihu, right? That's already happened. They're not thinking about God will sort this out.
So if you couldn't hear, the recognition is that they're trying to help God, help move things along, right? They're trying to help, my air quotes, help God. And we have a number of instances of how that turns out when we try to help God. I mean, go back to the conversation Sunday night about Abraham, right? It didn't end well. It just doesn't work. Doesn't work. So then in verse 20, again, it's me speculating perhaps, but I tried to put myself in Samuel's shoes and hear this message as Samuel would have heard it. And I would be tempted to take this as an offense. Perhaps Samuel did, perhaps he didn't. The text is silent. But part of our study is to try to understand really and recognize that this is an accounting. It's real people involved in these real situations. And real people have real feelings. Sometimes those feelings get hurt. Sometimes it's intended. Other times it's not. But, I did think that was, at least to me, that was an interesting thought exercise. Verses 6 through 8. Samuel understands the fallacy behind their request. Samuel understands that it's a rejection of the intended theocracy, of the theocracy that God intended and established when they were in the wilderness. Samuel understands this, and Samuel has more than one conversation with God about this. And as I've pointed out already, God recognizes, just do what they say, do what they ask.
Samuel set an example for us today how to deal with this. Go to the Lord. And then what happened? The Lord responded back to him. Now, like we take things to him now. He's going to respond to us in some form. Now, whether we accept it or not, which these people didn't, that can happen here too. So I think that's the key point there that he set out really early at this particular time, that I've got to go to the Lord about these things before just giving in to you or whatever, because it's your people, the Lord, it's not my people.
So if you couldn't hear, Joe was recognizing that Samuel, upon hearing the request, his first response was to go to God and say, this is what's been presented to me. What do I do? And Samuel sought God's guidance as step number one. Thank you, Joe. That was Mark.
Verse 19, there's almost an implication there that suggests that they might be going ahead with getting a king whether Samuel's involved or not. I mean, the way that reads sounds like, okay, you can anoint us a king in which you'll be involved, or we'll go get a king.
You're about to die anyway. Just let the old people die off, then the young people are going to do what they want. That's the. I hadn't thought about that. Good observation.
Everybody here says that it will be like other nations. God wants us to be set apart, not like all the others.
So the comment is that the observation is they are saying they want to be like other nations, but God wants us to be set apart. Thank you for saying that, because that's been the main point all along. God called Abraham out. And at the point God called Abraham and Abraham responded, Abraham was unlike everybody else on earth. God has always called out his people. God has always expected his people to be different. If you look at the laws that were put in place while the Hebrews were in the wilderness, starting with the Ten Commandments, and then all of the laws that flow out of that, and even summarized as greatest command, love God, love others. Those by their nature were different than all of the nations around them. God has always expected his people to be different. We are like that today. Yeah. Class number 2. We referred back to the verse, be in the world, but not of the world. I think that well summarizes the idea here. Thank you. Yeah.
We are so often referred to as a cult because we are different.
So the observation is we are often referred to as a cult because we are different within the churches of Christ. Okay, so Israel was different because they kept sacrificing all these animals. God's people will always be different. That's the kernel of the idea, in my opinion, of what it means to be set apart or holy for a purpose. So the challenge is, are you willing to do it? I'm glad it doesn't bother you. I said, I'm glad it doesn't bother you.
I also see a parallel here with Samuel taking it to God. And isn't that what we're supposed to do?
And that's what Joe was recognizing too, that Samuel's first response was to take it to God. Yeah, exactly. Jamie?
What purpose was Israel set apart for?
That's a really good question. I don't think there's a, you even laughed when you said the question. I mean, you had this grin on your face. You guys can't see it, but he's got this almost evil grin on his face. That is such a simple but big, I think it's a big question to answer. I will attempt, just based on where I am through the course of my own study in here. What was Israel, what was the purpose Israel was set aside for? I think the purpose was the same as ours, and that is to ultimately demonstrate God. Nation. What were the three promises?
Nation, descendants, and land.
Nation, descendants, and land. Nations. See, I was listening. Yes, sir. I wasn't listening well enough to have pulled it out the first time, but you're thinking.
My thought was they were set aside to deliver the Messiah. And they lost that plot and got to thinking that the special purpose was that they would be different and that they were special to God because they were them, right? They forgot that they were a channel to God's end, right? They were just the means, they weren't the end. And that's where some of these deviations come from. So how do we apply that to ourselves? Well, maybe not so clear.
Would we not be a means to an end in bringing others to Christ, to God? What is our purpose? I mean, we read God ultimately wants everyone to repent. So
We turn up and we do all the church activity stuff, but we don't really spread the word.
So maybe the way we turn the plot on its head is we show up and do all the church activities, but we never really fulfill our purpose. Yeah. I one time drew the analogy that my fear, in fact, it's one of my greatest fears, is that we as the church see God as a vending machine. We want to insert our coins of praise and worship, and then want those blessings to fly out of the chute at the bottom. And God doesn't work that way. This is all God's story. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Joseph, the Israelites, John the Baptist, we are the secondary characters in this story. Harry?
And that's the problem that Israel has with God, is that he's not a good nation. That they're not the greatest nation on earth. They ran from Egypt, they ran from Canaanites, they ran from everybody, but they want to be great so much that they're willing to have other gods when Moses is up in a mountain. We're going to create a God, even though we left a nation full of gods. But they're so big, they're so powerful. We want to be big and powerful too, to the fact that we will risk our children. We'll risk our vineyards. We risk our sons. We don't care what you're telling us, Samuel. Like Mark said, we're going to get a king one way or another because we want to be great. You could take all my sons and make this great, because it's not about winning the war. It's about the spoils of the war, because we want to be rich. We want to be great. We want to, like Peter said, who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom? You're still talking about being the greatest. And that's what Israel wants. Israel wants to be great. We don't want to be bullied. We don't want to have a hard life. We don't want manna from heaven. We want our own thing. That's what God tells Samuel. He says they've been chasing their own desires since I took them out of Egypt. And that's exactly, like everyone says, it's trickled down to us. Our own desires, and we don't want God to rule over our desires.
So I'll try to summarize. You're recognizing Israel wanted to be great. They were perhaps using the justification, Samuel, you're old, Samuel, your sons are evil. We want the practical fulfillment of an earthly king to serve as a judge, to lead us in war. All of those my word, not yours, but I think this is the spirit of what you're saying. All of those representing excuses, justifications for Israel doing what they wanted to do anyway. And then you move that forward, asking the same question of us, do we do the same thing? Did I capture the spirit of what you said? Good. All right.
You know, it comes down to the fact that we're no different in the same sense during this political season. What do quote-unquote people who profess to be Christians want? They want to elect a person that will save this country. But who can save this country? It's God. And so we need to go to God instead of depending on man to save the country. And so that's what we need to do, and that's what Israel should have done. We need to go to God, and God, you lead us. And so we need to follow God's word, even if we are different. We have to stand firm in that and not depend upon man.
A man will not solve our problems. Yeah. So let me put it in context in case you couldn't hear. Keith is recognizing in our current political season, even Christians are looking to elect the man that they believe will save our country. But you recognize a man is not going to save it. A man is not able to save it. We have to turn it over to God. We have like 1 minute left. If you will give me just a quick second, let me sort of work through my notes and see what we've already talked about, what we haven't. You guys are all over the board tonight. I can't keep up with you. So Samuel's sons were old. They were seen as corrupt. Samuel was old. Samuel's sons were seen as corrupt. We'll get into next week, but Saul, David, Solomon, I want you to be thinking about, this is your homework assignment, be thinking about, by the end of Solomon's reign, Israel looked a lot more like Egypt than they did anyone else. I mean, you get the irony there, I'm sure, don't you? So be thinking about that. The last point I'll make here, and I'll just try to summarize everything I think we've talked about, is that as the monarchy got established, Israel, the Israelites, the everyday folks, it reached the point where Israel was to serve the state rather than to serve God. The state had become, the nation itself had become its own entity. It had reached the point where it was to serve itself rather than Israel recognizing, as God intended all along, that God was in fact their king. There were earthly prophets, judges, elders. There were earthly representatives that were intended to serve as a system of checks and balances and help Israel maintain that focus. God intended to be a theocracy. The monarchy changed that so that Israel got what they asked for. They were just like every other nation, particularly Egypt, especially by the time we get to Solomon, particularly Egypt, which existed for its own purpose. Any last minute thoughts? Mark?
I'd like in this, and Keith alluded to this political season, I'd like for us to think about, in the statement you just made, has democracy replaced a monarchy in that statement?
So the question is, has our American democracy replaced the monarchy?
And we make the same arguments and same excuses around our nation that Israel did as they sought to establish a monarchy.
And we haven't learned much. We make the same excuses. Thank you all. Oh, sorry. You get the last word.
what I like to hear. So, you know, to Mark's point, you know, it's absolutely that, right? And God warned them of what would happen if they had a king, that they would be oppressed, that they would be beholden to him. But he said, I'm going to do this for you. But then all of that came true, right? And then in Romans, Paul's reminding them of the fact that God is in control of these leaders. And because of that, you have to be beholden to them. Because that is the way that God has intended. And they don't bear the sword in vain, right? So they're there to be agents of God, good or bad. You know, and we tend to forget that.
That last statement again, we tend to, I thought that's what you said, but I wanted to make sure. So Mark is recognizing that leaders then, just as leaders today, are there as agents of God. And they do bear the sword, in other words, execute justice, authorized to do so. And it's easy in our current political environment to forget that and maybe not provide the respect for the office that should actually be there. All right, we are out of time. Done. Thank you.